What if the Bible you were given left something out, something so dangerous one nation refused to remove it? Ethiopia kept the Book of Enoch alive for centuries, and it warns of watchers who never fully departed. What did they choose to hide from you? In the highlands of Ethiopia, inside monasteries carved from mountain rock, priests have guarded a text for over 1,000 years that the rest of the Christian world was told to forget. While Rome debated which scrolls belonged in Scripture, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church never let go of the Book of Enoch. They placed it inside their canon and kept it there, generation after generation, long after Western councils quietly pushed it into the shadows. Ask yourself why one nation would risk holding onto a text so fiercely while the rest of Christendom buried it. The answer sits inside the book itself. Enoch does not read like a comfortable bedtime story about angels with harps. It reads like a warning. It describes a group of heavenly beings called Watchers, sent to observe humanity, who instead grew fixated on the daughters of men. Genesis 6:2 gives us the shortened version, almost a whisper of what happened. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. One verse. That is all the Standard Bible allows itself to say about one of the strangest events in human history. Enoch refuses to stay quiet about it. The Ethiopian text names names. Semjaza, the leader who convinced 200 watchers to descend on Mount Hermon and bind themselves by oath to go through with the plan together, so that no single one of them could back out once the descent began. Azazel, who is said to have taught men how to forge weapons of war and taught women the art of adornment and seduction, arts that Enoch describes as leading the whole earth astray. These were not vague spiritual concepts. These were beings with faces, with agendas, with the audacity to teach humanity secrets that heaven never intended for us to hold. Metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, enchantments, knowledge that reshaped how ancient people lived, fought, and worshipped, dropped into human hands by entities who had no business handing it over. Enoch even lists other watchers by name, teachers of root cuttings, of the signs of the sun and moon, of the movements of the stars, as though the sky itself had been cracked open and its secrets poured out to people who were never meant to hold that kind of power. And their children were not ordinary. Scripture calls them Nephilim, and Enoch describes them as giants whose appetite for destruction outpaced anything humanity had known. Genesis 6:4 confirms the detail plainly. There were giants in the earth in those days. Enoch expands the picture further, describing beings who devoured the produce of men, then turned on men themselves, and finally turned on each other and on the animals of the earth, drinking blood and consuming flesh in a spiral of violence the world had never witnessed before the flood. Why does this matter now in your life, sitting wherever you are watching this? Because the question the Ethiopian Bible forces you to confront is not simply, did this happen? The question is, did it actually stop? Enoch does not describe the watchers as destroyed. It describes them as bound, chained in darkness, held for a future judgment, waiting. Jude 1:6. In the very New Testament you may already trust echoes this exact language. Angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day. Bound, reserved, not erased. If they are only bound, then something of their influence, their teaching, their fingerprints on human civilization may never have fully left us. Think about how much of what the Watchers taught still shapes the world you live in. Weapons technology has never stopped advancing since Azazel supposedly first forged a blade. Occult practices, divination, and hidden knowledge movements have never disappeared. They simply changed names and dressed themselves in new language across centuries, resurfacing in every generation under a different label while carrying the same fingerprints. Ancient sites like Göbekli Tepe, predating what we were taught was even possible for organized humans to build, sit in the ground as physical evidence that something extraordinary was happening on this earth, long before conventional history says civilization began. Baalbek stones cut and placed with a precision modern engineers still argue about sit in Lebanon as if daring us to explain them without acknowledging outside influence. Puma Punku, half a world away, presents the same impossible puzzle. stones cut with an exactness that tools of that supposed era should never have allowed. Coincidence becomes harder to believe the more of these sites you line up side by side. The Ethiopian church did not preserve Enoch because they enjoyed controversy. They preserved it because they understood something the rest of the world was pressured to let go of, that the full picture of our origins, our vulnerability, and our spiritual battlefield cannot be understood from Genesis alone. There is a reason the Apostle Jude, writing under inspiration, directly quotes Enoch by name in Jude 1:14-15, describing, "The Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all." A New Testament writer treated this text as trustworthy enough to quote directly. That single decision should stop you in your tracks. This was not fringe material to the early church. It was familiar enough, respected enough, true enough, that an apostle leaned on it to make his point. So here is where we are left standing. A book preserved by one faithful nation, a New Testament writer who trusted its words enough to quote them as authoritative, a description of beings bound, not banished, still awaiting judgment, and a modern world still shaped in ways we rarely stop to examine by knowledge that may have never been ours to have in the first place. If this is the kind of truth you have been hungry for, the kind that institutional teaching skated past far too quickly, you need to see everything Enoch actually reveals, laid out clearly, illustrated and organized, so none of it slips through the cracks the way it has for centuries. That is exactly why we created the Forbidden Book of Enoch, our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, walking you through the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the world before the flood, in full detail you will not find in a 15-second scroll through social media. The link lives in the very first comment pinned to this video, waiting for you. And if this channel is the place where you have been finding these answers, the ones that go beyond the surface, make sure you are subscribed, because what comes next digs even deeper into what was hidden from us. The flood was supposed to end it. That is the story most of us were handed in Sunday school, tied up neatly with a bow. God saw the wickedness of the earth, the corruption spreading through every bloodline touched by the Watchers, and he sent the waters to wipe the slate clean. Genesis 6:17 records the decision in blunt terms, "I do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven." One flood, one judgment. Problem solved, or so we were told. Except the text does not actually say that. Read Genesis 6:4 again slowly this time. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. After that. After the flood, giants are still being mentioned in Scripture, as though their presence continued rather than vanished. Numbers 13:33 places the Anakim, described as descendants of the Nephilim, still walking the land generations later, so massive that the Israelite spies sent to scout Canaan reported feeling like grasshoppers standing beside them, a comparison so vivid that 10 grown men chosen specifically for their courage came back shaking from what they had witnessed. These were not exaggerations born of fear alone. The report was consistent enough, detailed enough, that it shaped Israel's entire strategy for entering the Promised Land for an entire generation. If the flood erased every trace of this bloodline, how does Scripture keep running into giants long after the waters receded? Deuteronomy 3:11 gives us one of the most oddly specific details in the entire Old Testament. It describes Og, king of Bashan, as the last remnant of the Rephaim, and it tells us the size of his iron bedstead, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, roughly 13 feet by 6 feet. Why would Scripture bother recording the measurements of a bed frame unless it wanted future readers to sit with the sheer physical impossibility of a normal man ever using it? This was not folklore whispered around a campfire. This was written into the sacred record as historical fact, a detail meant to be remembered, preserved with the same careful precision Israel used to record the dimensions of the tabernacle itself. Whoever wrote this down wanted no ambiguity left for future generations to explain away. So how did they survive a global judgment meant to purge them entirely? This is where the extra-canonical texts fill gaps that Genesis leaves open. The Book of Jubilees describes evil spirits, the disembodied souls of the Nephilim who perished, continuing to roam the earth after the flood, tempting and corrupting humanity even without physical bodies to inhabit, afflicting people with sickness and leading them astray in ways ordinary human wickedness alone could not fully account for. Some traditions within the Book of Giants, recovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describe the sons of the Watchers receiving visions of their own coming destruction before the flood ever arrived, wrestling with dreams of judgment they could not escape, tablets of stone and gardens uprooted, imagery meant to convey that nothing they had built would be permitted to stand. Whatever physically happened to their bodies, something of their influence pressed forward into the world that came after, slipping through the one gap that no flood could seal shut, the human heart itself, still carrying the same capacity for corruption it always had. And notice how the pattern repeats itself almost immediately once the waters recede. Genesis 9:20-21 tells us Noah planted a vineyard, drank of the wine, and was found uncovered in his tent. A strange and uncomfortable episode that many readers rush past without asking why it was even included in a book that otherwise moves quickly through generations in a single verse. Genesis 9:22-25 follows with Ham's transgression against his father and the curse that falls on Canaan as a result, a curse whose bloodline would later produce the very Canaanite peoples the Israelites encountered, filled with giants. It is almost as though the corruption never actually left the family tree. It simply found a new branch to travel through. The pre-flood contamination did not stay behind with the water. It came aboard the ark hidden inside human weakness itself, tucked away in the one vessel that was supposed to represent a clean, fresh beginning for the whole earth. The ancient world outside Scripture tells a strikingly similar story. The Sumerian king list describes rulers with implausibly long reigns before a catastrophic flood, followed by kingship descending from heaven once more after the waters settled, as though whatever forces shaped humanity before the deluge picked up their work again once the ground dried. The Enuma Elish speaks of divine beings mixing with earthly material to fashion humanity in the first place, an unsettling echo of the very union Genesis 6 describes between heavenly beings and human women. Cultures with no contact with one another, separated by mountains, oceans, and centuries of isolated development, kept independently preserving the same core memory. Something from beyond human nature reached down, altered the bloodline, and its effects did not simply switch off once the water dried. When civilizations that never spoke to each other tell strikingly parallel stories, dismissing all of them as unrelated coincidence starts to feel far less reasonable than considering they may be describing the same buried truth from different angles. This is precisely why Ethiopia's preservation of Enoch matters so much to how we understand the rest of the Bible's giant narratives. Without Enoch's framework, Numbers 13 and Deuteronomy 3 read like strange, isolated footnotes, oddities tucked into genealogies, and conquest narratives that most sermons skip past entirely. With it, they read like confirmation. The Watchers were bound, yes, cast into darkness to await judgment, as Jude 1:6 describes. But their offspring, their teachings, and whatever spiritual residue their rebellion left behind, did not receive the same clean, final ending. Scripture keeps circling back to giants precisely because the writers understood something we have largely forgotten. Judgment on the source does not automatically erase everything the source already set into motion, which raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with as we continue. If the physical giants eventually died out through later conquests, defeated one by figures like David facing Goliath, what about the spiritual influence Enoch describes, the teachings of sorcery, warfare, and hidden knowledge that the Watchers poured into humanity before the flood ever came? Bodies can be destroyed. Ideas once released into a civilization are far harder to kill and far easier to inherit without ever realizing where they first came from. Ethiopia has always been trusted with things the rest of the world was never allowed to keep. Long before anyone debates the Book of Enoch, the same nation claims custody of something even more staggering, the Ark of the Covenant itself, said to rest inside a guarded chapel in Axum, watched over by a single monk for his entire life, a roll passed down through an unbroken chain so that the ark is never left unattended, not for a single hour, not for a single night. No pilgrim, no scholar, no head of state is ever permitted to look upon it directly. Whether or not you accept that claim, the pattern is impossible to ignore. This is a nation that has positioned itself across centuries as the keeper of sacred things too dangerous, too powerful, or too revealing for the wider world to hold on to. The Book of Enoch fits that pattern perfectly, a second treasure guarded not behind stone walls, but within the pages of a canon the rest of Christendom chose to close. So why did the West let it go? The answer is not as simple as it was fake or it was rejected outright. Early church figures wrestled with Enoch far more seriously than most modern believers realize. Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, defended the book's authenticity and argued that Noah must have preserved it through the flood precisely because it was too important to lose, a text he believed carried genuine prophetic weight worth protecting for future generations. Other early voices grew uneasy, not necessarily because the content was false, but because its vivid descriptions of angelic beings mingling with humanity made theologians uncomfortable in an era already fighting off strange heresies about angels, spirits, and hidden knowledge circulating among competing sects. Jerome, tasked with compiling the Latin Vulgate, simply left it out, offering little explanation beyond quiet omission. Augustine treated it with suspicion, acknowledging its antiquity, while questioning whether it had been faithfully transmitted across so many centuries. And once the most influential Latin translation of Scripture excluded it, the rest of the Western Church followed, generation after generation, until most Christians alive today have never even held a copy in their hands, let alone read the words themselves. Ethiopia never received that memo, and in some ways never needed to. Christianity arrived there early, independently, connected more directly to the Jewish and Semitic roots of the faith than the Latin-speaking West ever was. Their canon formed along a different path, shaped by different councils, different pressures, different politics. And so a text that Rome quietly buried remained in Ethiopia, exactly where it had always been, inside the sacred canon, read aloud, studied, and passed down without apology. This raises a question worth sitting with. If Enoch had truly been nothing but ancient fiction, harmless folklore about angels and giants, would it have provoked this much unease among the very men shaping what Christians were permitted to read? Fiction rarely needs quiet removal. Fiction gets ignored, not buried, not argued over in letters and commentaries across multiple generations of church leadership. The care taken to exclude Enoch from the Western canon looks less like dismissing nonsense and more like managing something that made powerful men nervous. And once you accept that possibility, the deeper question becomes unavoidable. If the Watcher's knowledge was real enough to unsettle church fathers centuries later, did that knowledge simply vanish once Enoch stopped being read in Latin-speaking churches? History says no. Ancient Egypt's priestly class guarded esoteric teachings about the stars, about transformation, about rituals meant to align the soul with cosmic forces, teachings historians still cannot fully trace back to any obvious human origin point, passed down through initiation chambers that outsiders were never permitted to enter. Babylon's astrologer priests read the heavens with a precision that modern scholars still find remarkable, mapping planetary movements centuries before the tools we assume were necessary for that kind of accuracy even existed, cataloging celestial cycles with an exactness that still checks out against modern calculations. Every one of these traditions echoes exactly what Enoch describes the Watcher's teaching: the movements of stars, the interpretation of signs, knowledge that reached humanity from somewhere beyond ordinary human discovery. The Hermetic tradition that later shaped medieval alchemy and Renaissance mysticism claimed its own origins, stretched back to a shadowy figure named Hermes Trismegistus, said to have received divine wisdom directly, wisdom concerning the stars, the elements, and the hidden architecture of the universe. That same body of teaching went on to influence secret societies, esoteric orders, and occult movements that persisted quietly across centuries of European history, resurfacing again and again under new names whenever public scrutiny grew too intense. Strip away the different names and cultural packaging, and you are left staring at the same core claim Enoch makes about Azazel and his companions: that certain knowledge did not originate with humanity, that it was given deliberately by beings positioned above us, and that once given, it could never fully be ungiven. Ephesians 6:12 tells us plainly that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Paul was not describing a metaphor. He was describing an ongoing, active reality, one where organized spiritual forces continue operating with intention long after any single historical event like the flood, adapting their methods to whatever era they find themselves operating within. If the Watchers' physical bodies were dealt with, and if their offspring eventually died out through conquest, the framework of spiritual influence Paul describes suggests the war itself never actually ended. It simply changed its battlefield from the physical descendants of the Nephilim to the ideas, systems, and hidden knowledge networks those beings left scattered across human civilization. This is why Ethiopia's decision to keep Enoch matters so much more than a simple footnote in canon history. It is a thread connecting an ancient rebellion in Genesis 6 to a persistent pattern of hidden knowledge resurfacing across Egypt, Babylon, and medieval mysticism, all the way to movements operating in plain sight today, hiding in plain language most people never stop to question. The Watchers were bound. Their teaching was not. And once teaching survives its teacher, it no longer needs the original source present to keep spreading. It only needs willing hands to carry it forward, generation after generation, disguised in whatever language each new century finds acceptable, wearing whatever mask allows it to pass unnoticed through the front door. Jesus of Nazareth spent an enormous portion of his earthly ministry doing something modern churches rarely emphasize: casting out demons. Not metaphorical demons, not psychological struggles reframed for an ancient audience that lacked modern vocabulary. The Gospels describe actual confrontations, actual entities speaking through possessed men, actual negotiations between Christ and forces that recognized exactly who he was the moment he appeared before them. Mark 5:7 records one such encounter in vivid detail, a man possessed by a spirit calling itself Legion, crying out, "What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not." That is not the language of superstition. That is the language of a being that already knew Christ, already understood judgment was coming, and already feared what his presence meant for its future. This was not an isolated event tucked into a single chapter either. Encounter after encounter across all four Gospels shows the same pattern repeating: entities that recognize divine authority instantly and respond with a mixture of terror and desperate bargaining. Here is where Enoch becomes indispensable to understanding what these spirits actually were. The Book of Jubilees and the broader Enochic tradition describe demons not as a separate category of creation entirely, but as the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim themselves, the offspring of the Watchers and human women, destroyed in body during the flood, but left wandering the earth without physical form. Unable to die the way flesh dies, unable to return to the heavenly realm their fathers were cast out of, these spirits were left in a kind of restless exile, seeking bodies to inhabit because their own had been stripped from them. Jubilees describes Noah himself pleading with God on behalf of his descendants once he witnessed these spirits beginning to lead his own grandchildren astray, a detail that suggests the corruption resumed almost the instant humanity repopulated the earth. If this framework is accurate, then every demonic encounter recorded in the Gospels is not a random spiritual event. It is a direct continuation of the Genesis 6 rebellion, still playing out centuries later, still requiring divine intervention to contain. This reframes the Legion account entirely. Mark 5:9 tells us, Jesus asked the spirit its name, and it answered, "My name is Legion, for we are many." A single man, possessed by a multitude, so overwhelming in strength that Mark 5:3-4 describes previous attempts to bind him with chains failing repeatedly, the chains snapping apart as though they were nothing, fetters shattered, no man strong enough to tame him. This was not ordinary human affliction. This was concentrated spiritual force, the kind of residual power Enoch attributes to beings whose fathers once taught humanity how to forge iron and wage war. When these spirits begged Jesus not to send them out of the country, and instead begged permission to enter a herd of nearby swine, Mark 5:13 records the outcome plainly. The herd, numbering about 2,000, ran violently down a steep place into the sea and were drowned. Even the animals could not contain what these spirits carried, their bodies unable to bear the same weight of corruption that had once animated warlords and tyrants among the Nephilim generations earlier. Matthew's Gospel adds another detail worth sitting with. Matthew 8:29 records demons crying out to Jesus, "Art thou come hither to torment us before the time?" Before the time. These spirits were operating with an awareness of a coming judgment, a specific future reckoning they knew was appointed, but had not yet arrived. A timeline they clearly understood, even if the humans watching them did not. This lines up precisely with 2 Peter 2:4, which describes God casting the angels who sinned down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. Reserved. Not yet finalized. The demons Jesus encountered throughout his ministry were not confused about their situation. They understood exactly where they stood in a timeline of judgment that stretched back to the days before the flood and forward to a day still to come, a day they clearly dreaded far more than anything a human exorcist could threaten them with. Consider what this means for how we read the entire gospel narrative. Every exorcism becomes a direct confrontation between Christ and the spiritual remnant of the Watchers' rebellion, a living demonstration that the war described in Genesis 6 and expanded in Enoch had never actually concluded. It had only shifted form. The physical giants were gone by the time of Christ, defeated through centuries of conquest, but the spirits their existence had produced were still active, still seeking bodies, still causing the kind of self-destructive violence Mark 5:5 describes when it tells us the possessed man spent his days and nights among the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones, a picture of torment that mirrors almost exactly the restless, wandering Jubilee's attributes to these very spirits. And Jesus' authority over these beings was never subtle or gradual. Luke 4:36 describes witnesses amazed at his command, saying, "What a word is this! For with authority and power he commandeth the unclean spirits, and they come out." No ritual, no prolonged struggle. A word spoken with authority these spirits could not resist, regardless of how many centuries they had spent embedded in the fabric of human suffering, regardless of how many generations had come and gone since their fathers first descended on Mount Hermon. This detail matters enormously if we take Enoch's framework seriously. If these truly were remnants of a rebellion stretching back to the days before the flood, then Christ's ability to command them instantly, without struggle, becomes one of the clearest demonstrations in all of Scripture that the judgment Enoch describes as coming for the Watchers was already, in some measure, breaking into the present through the authority of the Son of God. The implications stretch far beyond a first-century Galilean countryside. If the spiritual remnant of the Watchers' rebellion was active enough to require direct confrontation during Christ's ministry, the honest question becomes whether that same category of activity simply stopped the moment the apostolic age ended, or whether it continued operating in whatever form each subsequent era allowed it to take, quietly present in every century since, waiting for its final reckoning, the same way it was waiting outside that tomb among the pigs of Gadara. Revelation does not let this story end quietly. If Enoch describes the Watchers as bound and reserved for a future judgment, Revelation describes exactly what happens when that reservation finally expires. Revelation 9:1-2 describes a star fallen from heaven, given the key to the bottomless pit, opening it to release smoke that darkens the sun, smoke rising from a pit that has clearly been sealed shut for a very long time, waiting for precisely this moment to be opened after untold centuries of confinement, a confinement whose exact length no human chronology has ever been able to calculate with certainty. What emerges from that pit is not vague or symbolic in a way that lets us dismiss it as poetic flourish. Revelation 9:3 describes locusts coming out of the smoke given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power, and Revelation 9:7-10 describes these beings with faces like men, hair like women, teeth like lions, and tails like scorpions with stings. This is not standard apocalyptic imagery borrowed loosely from nature. This reads like a description straining to put words to something genuinely foreign to human categories. Something John himself struggled to describe using any vocabulary available to a first-century writer standing on the island of Patmos, forced to reach for the strangest combination of familiar creatures he could find, just to give his readers something to hold on to. Revelation 9:11 adds a detail that should stop any careful reader cold. These beings have a king over them, the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. A named ruler, presiding over beings released from a pit specifically described elsewhere in Scripture as the place reserved for the angels who sinned, a designation that leaves little room to read this as anything other than the direct continuation of the very rebellion Enoch describes unfolding on Mount Hermon. Jude 1:6 already told us these fallen beings were reserved unto the judgment of the great day, language that matches almost exactly the imagery Revelation uses centuries later to describe their eventual release. The Watchers were never destroyed. They were detained, held in reserve, awaiting an appointed hour that Revelation suggests is still ahead of us rather than safely behind us, an hour with a name attached to the being who governs it, as though even in judgment there remains a structure and hierarchy to what is unleashed. This is precisely the imagery Ethiopia's preserved Book of Enoch anticipates directly, having warned of it long before John ever received his vision on Patmos. Enoch describes the same bound beings awaiting a day when they will finally answer for what they did on Mount Hermon, when they taught forbidden knowledge and corrupted an entire generation before the flood arrived to cleanse the earth. Enoch's own account of judgment describes fire, chains, and a pit prepared specifically for these fallen beings, imagery so consistent with what Revelation later describes that it becomes difficult to treat the two texts as unrelated coincidences written centuries apart by authors with no access to each other's work. One text, hidden away for most of Christian history, and another sitting openly in every Bible printed in the last 2,000 years, describing the exact same fate for the exact same category of beings. Consider what this means for how we understand the present moment we are living in right now. If the Watchers and their offspring's lingering spiritual influence were active enough to require Christ's direct intervention during his earthly ministry, and if Revelation describes a final release of bound spiritual forces still ahead in human history, then the corruption this entire story began with in Genesis 6 has never actually reached its conclusion. We are living somewhere in the middle of a story whose first act unfolded before the flood, and whose final act, according to Revelation, has not yet been written. Every generation since Noah has lived inside this unfinished narrative, inheriting both the corruption the Watchers introduced and the promise that judgment on that corruption remains certain, however long it delays, however comfortable each passing century becomes at forgetting the story ever began in the first place. This is why the details Ethiopia refused to let go of matter so profoundly for anyone trying to understand Scripture, honestly rather than superficially. Enoch is not a strange sideshow to the biblical narrative. It is connective tissue linking Genesis to Revelation, explaining why demons behaved exactly as they did in the Gospels, why Paul described unseen powers actively at war with humanity, and why John's apocalyptic visions describe beings emerging from a pit as though their release had been anticipated for thousands of years before it finally happened. Remove Enoch from the conversation, and huge portions of Scripture read like isolated, unexplained fragments, strange details left dangling with no clear thread tying them together. Restore it, and the entire narrative locks into place with a coherence that should make anyone pause and reconsider how casually this book was set aside by councils centuries ago. Men who perhaps understood exactly what they were choosing to leave behind. None of this should leave you living in fear. Scripture is remarkably consistent that whatever spiritual conflict continues beneath the surface of human history, the outcome was already decided the moment Christ walked out of an empty tomb. 2 Peter 2:9 reminds us that the Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptations, even while reserving the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished. The Watchers, their offspring, and whatever influence still lingers from that ancient rebellion operate on borrowed time, under a sentence already passed, awaiting an execution date that Revelation makes clear will not be delayed forever. Understanding this story is not about living anxiously, glancing over your shoulder at shadows, or seeing hidden conspiracies behind every ordinary event. It is about recognizing that the God who bound these beings the first time around has already proven through Christ that his authority over them was never in question to begin with, and will not be in question when the final chapter finally arrives. That certainty is meant to steady you, not unsettle you, the same way it steadied a man once possessed by an entire legion of spirits who was later found sitting, clothed, and in his right mind at the feet of Jesus. Ethiopia kept this story alive for a reason, and now you carry a piece of it too. Thank you for walking through this with us today. If these hidden truths stirred something in you, subscribe to this channel right now, because more forbidden history is waiting for you on this screen the moment this video ends. Hit like, drop a comment telling us what surprised you most, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want the full depth behind everything the Watchers left in their wake, our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, is linked in the first pinned comment below. Go claim it.